He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
As India marked its 75th Republic Day on the 26th of January, I happened to be here, and it's been a real throwback to my childhood growing up celebrating the day with a lot of pride and the slightly painful march past practice at school. It's a huge day for the country, and in New Delhi, the parade has always been a real spectacle. Yep, it's the most populous nation in the world, but also set to be a leading economy by the end of this decade. In New Zealand, the courting process began many years ago, the pursuit of a free trade agreement and deeper trade relations being high on the agenda of the previous and this government.
I have a lot of respect for him and for India. He had a lot of respect for our new government as well and what we're trying to do. And so it was a very good bilateral meeting. We talked a lot about how these are two countries that should have a broader and deeper relationship. And in particular, we thought there were huge opportunities to advance our bilateral relationship around the people-to-people connections, whether it's education and tourism. But also we talked about advancing work around agri-tech and also around even space.
Prime Minister Christopher Luxon there talking last year about his meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But what does that ideal bilateral relationship between the two countries look like, whether the FTA happens or not?
Kadambari, I do not know much about an FTA, and I really don't know what it's going to do. But here are the facts.
That's Sunith Prakash, and for him, the answer lies in tech.
India is a global IT powerhouse, right? Number one, Satya Nadella was in Bangalore, and he's promised to invest $40 billion in India over the next 5 years. He's not giving charity to India. Those days are over, right? What he's doing is developing skills, so there's a supply of skills to Microsoft. Point number two, with the demographics of India and New Zealand, in New Zealand, we have a rapidly growing economy. Whereas economies such as India, Africa, and other Asian countries, Indonesia, and so on and so forth, we've got a bulge at the bottom. 60% of India's population is below, let's say, 25, maybe 30. New Zealand is not going to be able to sustain its old age and taxes unless it gets people from outside. So migration is not going to go away. With that, everything that technology is doing in terms of AI, tech space, cloud computing, quantum computing, we've got to get onto that bandwagon. And I don't think the FTA does enough. I really do not know about it. What we're doing is talking logs, we're talking fruit, we're talking meat, we're talking milk, we're talking dairy. We should be talking weightless, high-value services.
Kia ora and welcome back to a fresh series of Here Now with me, Kadambari Dagokumar. How good to be back. I'm talking today to Sunith Prakash, you just heard there, who's a Wellington-based tech expert and writer who's been going between India, Australia and New Zealand for over 2 decades now, observing tech trends globally.
I find India and the way it embraces technology really, really exciting. So I've been writing since about the early 90s on everything that I saw in India. I traveled to India 1990 or 1991 or thereabouts, and I came back and I wrote my first publication. And that was about the satellite revolution in India. So on the terrace of our building, there was a satellite dish. And the operator was somewhere local. And, if I wanted to see a cricket match, Mum would call him and he would come upstairs and turn it. And then I would be able to see a match in New Zealand, then in Australia, then in India, and then in South Africa. And, if you remember that boom and what it is today, it was a very powerful story to me. And Dr. Manmohan Singh was the prime minister in 1991, and he liberalized the economy. I was already outside India, but I could see the changes every time I went back. India was definitely embracing technology left, right, and center. And then subsequently, when we would go to India, we'd find, people that you did not expect to have cellular phones to be carrying cell phones. And then suddenly we found, of course, on the back of digital connectivity being so cheap, that there was entertainment and all kind of content on the phones and so on and so forth.
Sunith has followed the contribution of Indian diaspora and their successes in IT all around the world. And in one of his articles, he states that Indian IT professionals are estimated to have contributed more than $350 million to the New Zealand economy in 2020 alone. But Sunit feels that not enough has been done to recognize and amplify this potential.
In about 1997, we as a family went to Australia. When I arrived over here, I felt that this country was slightly backward. When I went to Australia, I saw the relationship between Australia and India. I also saw the Indians in Australia, and I saw the stereotype that Sri Lankans and Indians and Malaysians and Singaporeans had. Typically, we'd go for an open house, and then at an open house, not only were we welcomed in, but the Indians would be in IT, the Sri Lankans would be accountants, and right, a very different stereotype to over here. When we came back to New Zealand, it confirmed to me that actually we are about 10, 20, 30 years behind Australia as far as the relationship with India is concerned.
Do you think New Zealand's now beginning to value the Indian diaspora for its contribution towards technology in New Zealand, or are we still sitting on a fence about that?
We're not even sitting on the fence. We are sitting on the other side where New Zealand ignores. It's blind to it. So this is the biggest natural resource that New Zealand has when it comes to India, right? And I'm saying, look at the examples of Australia, look at the Silicon Valley, and surely there are some lessons to be learned from here.
Through his group, New Zealand's Centre for Digital Connections with India, Sunit's work these days focuses on trying to drive change in a few different ways. Recognizing the wealth of tech potential in the Indian diaspora in New Zealand and leveraging it for bilateral collaboration between New Zealand and India.
We are celebrating successes, role models, lining up mentors and so on and so forth, because for some reason, the Indians in New Zealand have adopted and taken it to a whole different level, the tall poppy syndrome. Let us not stand out. I'm standing out and I'm ready to be counted, and I'm dragging them with me, and they're coming.
But there's a lot more at play here, well beyond tall poppy syndrome. Sunit says that one of the biggest blocks when it comes to fully leveraging the potential of the Indian IT workforce here is the racial perception of Indian immigration to New Zealand from the early 1900s.
The big difference between the Silicon Valley, Australia, and New Zealand is that, unfortunately, New Zealand has carried some baggage. So the Indian diaspora in New Zealand has a lot in common with parts of Africa, like South Africa, Uganda, Kenya. It has a lot in common with Fiji, and it has a lot in common with the Caribbean islands. Whereas compared to Australia, and mind you, both Australia and California, they had some early Sardar Sikh sugarcane farmers who are still there, but very few. And so they did not have to, there was no negative racial stereotyping, and the stereotype did not have to be dismantled. Whereas over here, New Zealand has to dismantle first and then build, or the two need to coexist simultaneously.
So as a diaspora, it's about time, Sunit says, that the community in New Zealand is seen beyond just Diwali celebrations or food, art and culture.
Absolutely, there's a place for song and dance, culture, religion, and so on and so forth. But that's all we seem to be doing. We have been exotic for too long. We need to step up. It's incumbent on the royal we, whether it's India, New Zealand, and the tech professionals. There needs to be some kind of a coming together, not just a chamber of commerce, not just song and dance and Indian associations, but hey, we want to test out the premise. Are Indian successes in New Zealand valued by, let's say, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, or would we like to showcase them when the Prime Minister Modi comes to New Zealand, or are we going to do a song and dance? And so that is one. So we need to test that hypothesis from an Indian perspective. We also need to test that hypothesis from a New Zealand perspective. Do we value these natural resources that do not require any resource management act to mine? It's all here, right?
So what does that tech collaboration look like between New Zealand and India?
The largest providers of software services or product or SaaS to the New Zealand government are people like SAP, Salesforce, Oracle, Microsoft, ServiceNow. Let's keep aside that many of their CEOs are of Indian ethnic origin in the US, but they all have global competency centers in India, right? And so that supply chain is actually not very long. It's actually short. Once you sign the deal, very often your support or your code would be coming from there. And I'm saying we need to be very vested as a country in this supply chain. How can we shorten it? A company like Vista Entertainment or even Zero, all the brain work can come from here, but it can scale up to develop or support perhaps from there. Nobody's talking about taking away jobs from here. What I'm saying, that country may give us the opportunity to scale up globally. We can still be the clever country. The IP resides over here. So India is a very, very rich source. It's not only a market in its own right, it is also a source of capital.
Suneeth Prakash there talking to me about how tech is where it's at when it comes to taking New Zealand-India relations to a whole new level. I'm Kadambari Raghukumar, and each week I produce an episode of Here Now, where I get to talk to global people living in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We chat about latest international trends and topics, culture, identity, and the New Zealand experience. Check out the podcast on all your favourite podcast platforms, and you can find us on the RNZ website as well. Thanks for listening.